Let's start out, maybe we should do this one at a time instead of just say, let's start with the first thing. What is the first great solution? And then we'll get to another one. What's the first great solution that if you were running the country, if you were running the world, what should we be doing if you actually had the voice? If the president saw this video, if Bill Gates saw this video, what's step one that you think or you know we could or should be doing?
You go.
I'd love this question, and I think it's a defining question for our time in a way. I think what you're describing in many ways are a collection of symptoms, and if I look at it as a physician, I'm thinking, what's the underlying diagnosis? And I think the underlying diagnosis, sustainability is inevitable. It's going to happen. It's just a matter of how radical a disruption it's going to take for us to get to a point, and what's going to be left when we get to that point of sustainability. I think what we're looking at as a diagnosis is the profound disruption of our entire economic system by fossil fuels over a very long period. And so we're trying, as we try to transition to a sustainable, solar-powered, renewable society, we think, that just doesn't fit the way we live and this world that we've created. And the reason it doesn't fit is because we have lived in this artificial world created by fossil fuels and easy energy for a very long time. In terms of what we can do, I think the first thing we have to do is really reimagine the present and the future much more aggressively than we are doing. I think that the last time we had a sustainable solar-powered society was the 18th century, and there were about 1 billion people in the world. We have to actually go back and look at the 18th century, think about how people lived, and say, okay, if we took modern technologies and we reimagined the 18th century in a way that was, where we brought what was useful from the present, how could we live? How can we change our society to be something that is sustainable and in a way that will not require the kinds of disruption that will happen if we just go with the status quo?
If I was the president, have I got it on? Yeah. If I was the president, I'd love to be the president.
I'll vote for you.
Just imagine what you could do. You've got the bully pulpit. You're the commander-in-chief. You've got access to the media. And I would use that access to educate and inspire the population about all these issues. The threat of nuclear war, teach them. I'd teach them about global warming, why it's happening, and who's running the government, like the corporations who are producing global warming. I would use the bully pulpit to make sure the corporations didn't have the power they'd had. I'd not violate, but cancel Citizens United so that money can't be poured into campaigns. I'd make voting compulsory. I would, as in Australia, if we don't vote, we get fined $50. Let me think, what else was I going to do? I would, educate people about global warming and all the ramifications of that and the medical consequences, because I'm a doctor and I'd be a physician president, and then explain to everyone how we can alleviate global warming, and the solutions are all here. And we heard today from Seth about what can be done. It's all there. We just have to change the minds of the people, and if the people move, the politicians move. If the people don't move and the people remain ignorant, the politicians are the servants of the corporations. The corporations move into the vacuum left by the people. I'd educate the people about 80,000 chemicals in common use that we use all the time, most of which have not been tested by the EPA for carcinogenicity. I changed the law so it was up to the chemical companies to prove these chemicals were safe and not up to us to prove that they're dangerous. I would teach people about the dangers of nuclear power and how cancer is caused, and I'd close down all the nuclear reactors in this country. I think that's probably, and covers it.
It's a good start, yeah.
That was a lot more than one.
Oh, was it one? No, I was going to be president, so that's one.
That's the
One
one.
was president.
Electee
Right.
president is the one, yeah. I think if I had to pick one thing, Robert hit the nail on the head that underlying all of the symptoms that Steve described is our use of fossil fuels, or almost all of the problems. And so the question is, what is the one thing that we can do? The most powerful thing to get us off fossil fuels is something I talked about in my lecture, is putting the cost, the real cost of those fossil fuels in front of the consumer through a carbon tax. People don't like the word tax, but putting the price on carbon that it actually costs us. We're all paying it already, but we don't realize it, and so we're making the wrong choices. If you put that tax on carbon, suddenly burning those fossil fuels, you know it's expensive. As I said, it already is, but you don't know it. Then you would know it, and then you're going to stop doing it.
Hello? I certainly agree with Seth that we have to price the problem in effect, and whether you call it a tax or a cap and trade or fee and dividend, there's several ways to do it, but there's a hidden cost, just like there was with cigarette smoking and cancer, and it certainly comes from heating this planet. That's going to have effects on drought and disease and all these other things. But I hate to say it's not as simple as we might like to think, because at 7 billion people, back to Bob's mention that we had 1 billion people back in the 1800s. We're now 7 billion headed to 10. We've got to be realistic here. And if we're going to advocate solutions, I mean, I agree with Seth's approach that we need to get things into the marketplace. Educating people is fine, but Obama's been trying to educate people about some climate change things. People don't want to hear it, okay? He certainly tried some things, whether you disagree with his approach or not. We've tried to educate people about lots of things, and yet money and it's Citizens United, as Helen said, and she's right, is unfortunately an abysmal legal situation. But here we are. We've got to start thinking about the future, like, a few generations hence. How we get there is going to be hard enough, but I think we almost have to re-envision what the world's like. Now, some of you might think that there should be no cattle or beef consumption or dairy, and that's possible, let's say. But again, how do you educate the world or motivate them or come up with a system that's going to get to sustainability, back to that phrase? People imply that we know the answer. We don't know the answer. Helen and I disagree about whether there should be nuclear power. Now, there's no right or wrong. There really isn't right or
didn't
wrong.
know we disagreed.
We disagree.
Do we?
Yes, we do.
Oh.
Yeah, I think that I thought that was clear last
You
night.
want to fight?
No, I don't want to fight. I didn't know you were like that.
I am.
That the fact is, carbon and warming this planet is going to cause huge problems. And if you take the 28% or whatever it is that nuclear power provides off the table at the moment, that just creates a higher burden of how we're going to create out of solar energy. I don't know whether we should have nuclear or not, frankly, okay? But my point is that with this many people trying to give them enough protein, and if you want it, and water that's safe, and deal with the disease issues that are going to change as climate's changing, and there's a limit to how much solar we can produce, how quickly, and other renewables. We've got to be realistic. There's no point in just wishing things were going to be solved, because we're dealing in a world of reality here. And whether it be that the growth that's going to happen in Asia and Africa and population is going to double in the next 30 or 40 years, we feel a humanitarian issue there, many of us. It's a complex situation. I don't think even if any of us were president of not only the United States or the world, that there's a simple answer. So I have to start with that. I do think the free market needs to be used. I don't think dictatorial, government-centered control is the answer. I actually embrace the free market, but we've distorted the free market. Corn ethanol is a good example. It's not good gas, but it was implemented because a lot of people with those refineries making corn ethanol made a lot of money, and the farmers got a better price for corn, and we jacked up the price of food, and it was really stupid policy to use corn ethanol in our gas tanks in the name of energy independence. So we don't, I mean, some of us may think we have the right answer, but in a world of 7 billion people headed to 10 billion inevitably now, with the disease and nutrition problems we have, there is not a simple answer. But I do think we have to find ways to get it into the marketplace and get out of the distortions to the marketplace.
So just to make sure we're on the same conversation, are we thinking that climate change is what we're discussing, or are we thinking resource depletion is this thing, or are we talking about danger of nuclear power? Or like in my mind, very often I think climate change is the issue, but there are other people that think water shortages and food shortages are much more risk. So what is it, if there's a hierarchy of what we're actually most concerned about, what's the hierarchy that in your mind, if you have children and in 30 years you're concerned about something, what's the hierarchy of what you're concerned? Are you more concerned about climate change? Are you more concerned we're not going to have water, or we're going to have storms? How do you see it?
I mean, if we allow the path, imagine the path we're on from energy, water, nuclear, climate, food, and all of the issues and disease, just go 30 years forward on the current path. They're all going to be a problem. But I think we agreed that climate, if we allow CO2 to climb to 600 or 800 and the planet to be 4 or 5 degrees warmer, everything gets worse. Disease, water, weather changes, et cetera. It's not to say it's a more pressing concern, but it's a slower one to reverse. You can fix a lot of other things in 30 years. You can't reverse climate change in 30 years, is the problem.
Yeah, I mean, I think all these things are so intricately linked that in some ways it's a mistake to try to pull one out and say this is the big problem. And also the solutions are going to be intricately linked. And I think we have to look at things like, we're going to have to reinvent our food supply. We're going to have to reinvent our patterns of human settlement. We've got, people live in ways that are, live out in suburbs, and our solution to that is to build a Tesla so people can drive comfortably back and forth on electric power. But really what we have to do is completely reinvent the suburb and figure out how we change that into something that looks, more like a 17th century village where people lived together and worked closely together and walked a lot, and you didn't think in terms of, I'm going to go drive 20 miles to where I work. That is totally unsustainable.
Well, as I spoke this morning as a physician, and we both are, if we have a patient with a complex set of symptoms, we take a very detailed history, we take their clothes off and thoroughly examine them, we do a series of laboratory tests when indicated, we make the diagnosis, and we concentrate on the most pressing issue for that patient. And that's what the President could do is bring together a group of highly trained scientists and physicians and sit around as we do when we've got a complex patient with renal disease and neurological disease and work out how best to approach the treatment of this patient. And the planet is the patient in the intensive care unit at the moment. It's very complex, but the solutions actually can be implemented. They're there, but it takes a lot of very careful thinking. In terms of what I find the most severe issues facing the planet are, number one, and I talked about this morning, nuclear war. I kid you not, the situation in the Ukraine between Russia and America is extremely serious. I told you that Putin has his weapons on a higher state of alert. I told you that America probably does. I told you they're conducting nuclear war exercises very close to each other's border. They're being very belligerent. And I said to my family, I'll be home if there isn't a nuclear war, and I mean it. And there's nothing in the media about it really at all. Everyone's practicing psychic numbing. If there's a nuclear war, there will be no future and our children have no future. Number one, so that we must abolish nuclear weapons rapidly, and the only country that can initiate that is America. If America moves, then Russia will, she said she will, and the other nuclear nations will. So that's imperative. And I've told you at the UN, they've just been discussing this last week for a few weeks, and the nuclear nations blocked any move towards rapid bilateral nuclear disarmament. That's number one. Number two, global warming is extremely serious, and there are solutions if we put our heads together. We're highly intelligent. If we're well motivated, we can work it out. I don't know about the free market. I won't get into that. And the third thing is, well, Seth has a lot of solutions. Nuclear power, Seth said this morning, you have to build one nuclear power plant every week until 2050 to make, every day to 2050 to make any difference at all in global warming. But wait a minute. So then I'd educate people about nuclear power and shut it down because they're cancer factories and bomb factories. Period. Those are the three most important issues that I see as a physician facing our children as a paediatrician.
So a few things. First, I guess nuclear war would solve global warming.
It would. Nuclear winter, absolutely. Yep.
And a lot of these other problems, population growth.
Everything. Yeah.
So I think a lot of the challenges that Steve described all come back to one thing, as I alluded to before, the food challenges, water scarcity. A lot of these are dramatically exacerbated by climate disruption. That's what wreaks havoc on agriculture, which is where the food comes from, and we can't grow the crops properly because we don't have reliable water resources that we can depend upon because the weather keeps going crazy because of climate disruption. So it all comes back to that in my mind. Yeah, I'll just leave it at that.
Would you clarify what?
Oh, yeah, sorry, let me, just to pick up on what you said about the nuclear power,
Yeah.
just to make sure we set the
understand.
record straight. What I was saying is that to get to a scale where you could power the entire planet exclusively with nuclear power, in the year 2050, you would have to build a new nuclear power plant every day starting today until then. You could make a dent in the energy mix. I mean, we are making a dent in the energy mix with it today.
So I just wanted to make one point. Nuclear power is a potent source of global warming because nuclear reactors don't stand alone. No, they don't produce any CO2 when you fission uranium, but you have to dig up millions of tons of earth and uranium to fuel a reactor. Then you have to mill it, enrich it, which uses a hell of a lot of energy. 2 huge coal-fired plants at Paducah produce the electricity to enrich the uranium. And then you have to build a reactor, and then you have to store the waste safely and cool it for many years, and then you have to store it isolated for 1 million years, according to the EPA, isolated from the ecosphere. So nuclear power on its own, and there's a wonderful man called Storm van Leeuwen, a Dutchman, who's done the whole nuclear fuel cycle or chain, and the amount of CO2, CFCs, and other global warming gases that are produced to produce a nuclear power plant. So it's a myth that nuclear power is clean, green, and sustainable. It's a lie.
Oh.
And the first chapter of my book, Nuclear Power is Not the Answer, deals with that specific issue.
I think we know, Helen, your position very clearly. You're very consistent, and that's great. But
it's scientific. I'm quoting facts.
Okay, Helen. What I think we need to do is start to think about a different world of the future, okay? And of course yours is without any nuclear. But I do think we need to begin thinking almost like architects here, which Robert's first comment made me think of, that if you go back 200 years to a different world that you think, and both of you alluded to it, that was sustainable but without electricity, if you will. But we can't go back to that world exactly. And the problem is that our population has risen tenfold in the intervening 200 years. And not only are we addicted to cell phones and internets and Twitters and all these other things, but we have to be practical here, because either we're going to learn from our disasters and mistakes, all of them, from drinking water to nuclear to coal and tar sands and so on, overfishing the seas and mercury-laden fish and all these other things that we've got going on and how it affects our bodies. I mean, we know that this current path is headed to disaster. We are headed over the cliff, right? I think we all agree that. If we don't make some change this century, it's a very bleak situation, even absent nuclear war, okay? That from a drinking water supply and protein and health and so on, that we have a very dire situation. So maybe one way to think of it isn't what we need to do tomorrow, what the president would say tomorrow, et cetera, but to say, here we are, headed 7 billion headed to 10 billion with all these tensions. What could society look like knowing what we know as humans? We're going to probably go through a dark period to get to a better period. I mean, I don't think we're going to instantly improve this starting tomorrow. But the fact is, we're probably going to hit the wall on some things with climate. It's probably going to get worse. The ice is going to melt, sea level is going to rise. We're having a shortage of water in California. We're going to have to cut out some agriculture because of water usage. I think one of the interesting ways to think about it is say, okay, let's imagine 3 or 4 generations hence. What would the world look like? Would we have these self-encompassed cities? Well, those were designed, actually. There are cities in America that have been like that, where people live and work. Columbia, Maryland was one of them, for example. There are a number of communities like that, and I think that does have some promise. But again, when you get to 10 billion people, and them all wanting to live at our lifestyle, as Helen said yesterday, that everybody emulates America, what does that world look like is an interesting question, because saying we can get smart people around the table and figure it out, I think ignores the realities when you look at implementing any solution today. I mean, our government's going to stay. Is it going to be a world government? Is it going to be the nations we know today, or when nations start going underwater and cities start going, underwater and things like that, do national governments start dissolving? Do we go into city-states more? I mean, not to be too radical, but one or the other is going to happen. I don't think we will stay with the present few hundred nations 100 years from now. I do think we're either going to have more of a global governance, which is hard to imagine, or more of a localized governance. Because in a lot of places, they're going to have to start fending for themselves. A lot of cities today say, well, I'll deal with this when the government pays me to, as if the federal government has enough money to keep funding things. So we need to think about this governance structure, I think.
One of the solutions that we all, us lay people who are non-scientific, just kind of think all the time is, all right, just make the whole thing solar. It sounds great, make everything solar and wind. So what is preventing us from once and for all? I understand we have governments that interfere, but if we got the right government in, or a country that had the right approach, do we right now know how to say, if we had complete cooperation and we're willing to fund it, do we know how to power the country by solar, or is the technology not there?
Let me address that one. So, first of all, you can't just change overnight. That's just not going to happen. We have massive investments in our current energy infrastructure, and no one's going to turn that off tomorrow. But let's just say you did. How quickly can you bring in renewable energy sources to make up the balance? So if you want to take nuclear off the table, as Helen would argue, you're going to need a lot of what's called baseload power from somewhere else. Baseload power means power that's on all the time. So solar power is not that, and neither is wind, because the sun is not shining when it's cloudy, and the wind is not blowing when it's calm. And so you have this variability in solar and wind that needs to be dealt with, because our demand is smooth, not jumpy, like we don't all stop using our air conditioner if a cloud blocks the sun. And so what do you do to get baseload power if you're not going to use nuclear and you don't want to use fossil fuels? Where else can you go? So you can go to hydropower, hydroelectric dams. It's a great way to get baseload power. We get a lot of electricity that way today, but there are limits to just how much power worldwide you can get from hydropower. It will be a big piece of the puzzle, but it doesn't answer the baseload need all by itself. If we're going to do it just with other variable sources like solar and wind, what we need to do is to store that energy when we have extra. So in the middle of the afternoon, when the sun's really bright and your solar panels are blasting out electricity, generally you actually can't use all that electricity. There's more than you could use, and you just throw it away in today's electric grid. What we can do, though, is we can save that energy and use it when everyone comes home from work and turns on their televisions and air conditioners and plugs in their Teslas and whatever else and starts drawing more power. That's when the peak in demand is. Unfortunately, it's not when there's the peak in the sunshine. And so if we can store that power and shift it so it's available to use later on, we can solve this problem of the variability. And there are many ways in which you can store that energy. One way would be with batteries. Tesla just came out with this product. Elon Musk's company just came out with this product that is selling like crazy. So there's clearly a public demand, hunger for this type of technology. That's one way, is electrical storage, batteries like that. Another way to store it is thermally. So the sun gives us a lot of heat, and you can store that heat actually much more easily than you can store electricity in a battery. You can think a coffee thermos, how long a good coffee thermos keeps your coffee hot, right? Hours and hours and hours. You can do the same thing with other fluids, where the sun heats them up to get super hot, hundreds of degrees Celsius, and you store them in an insulated container, and they're just sitting there waiting for you to use them, and now you can use those later to boil water, make steam, turn turbines, make electricity, just like from a coal-fired power plant or a nuclear power plant, except that energy came straight from the sun. So there are options for baseload power. Those technologies exist today, but they need to get scaled up massively, and the costs still need to come down.
Yeah, there's two other things you can do that you didn't mention, which is one is long-term transmission of electrical energy, so that you can, if it's not windy in Florida, but it's windy in Georgia, you can transmit power over a distance, and you can get some smoothing of the variability in solar energy that way. The other thing that's been looked at, and I think will become more common, is demand management, where you look at devices that could be on, it doesn't matter whether they're on now or on 3 hours from now, and you can control when those are on based on the availability of power. And I think that's one thing that I know utilities are exploring, and I would expect we'll see more of.
Yeah, a good example of that's actually that Tesla car. When you come home from work at the end of the day and you plug that thing in, you just want to charge it in the morning. You're probably not taking it out again, so you don't need it to charge when you plug that thing in. It can charge from midnight to 4 a.m., and you'd be perfectly happy with that when there's very little demand on the grid. That's a good example of what Robert's referring to.
Aside from the climate disruption and resource depletion conversation, Dr. Morris, you speak about water. Are you concerned that the situation with the amount of, I'll call it chemicals that are in our air, water, land, soil, food, clothing, furniture, is this something that could rise to the point that could have such an effect on society? One of the statistics I read when I started this, and remember, I have no scientific background at all. I'm just a random person who's reading articles, and one of the things I read is that the sperm counts have gone down by 50%, and autism rates are rising like crazy. So is the chemicals that we're spouting, and I guess you could throw into this, the radiation that's out there, and the cell phone radiation, and is any of this rise at some point to a level of concern that we could, destroy ourselves in the next 30, 40, 50 years from that stuff? Is that?
Well, it might help reduce the 10 billion people we're worried about. But as Helen said earlier, I think we have this paradigm that's been created by default in a way where the burden is on us to prove that a chemical is hazardous or an exposure is hazardous to have anything happen to it. To me, the most striking example is the fact that glyphosate has just been declared a probable carcinogen. And I've watched as Monsanto has launched this unbelievable assault on science and on the they're trying to discredit the World Health Organization and treat it as if it's some rogue organization for declaring glyphosate a carcinogen, because it's by far the most heavily used chemical, herbicide in the world, and they've created this monster of a plant that allows them to, it can exist where you can just spread the glyphosate so heavily that no plant can grow except this miracle corn. And they present this as a wonderful solution, and everybody's going to starve if we ban glyphosate. I think we've created a society that's very dependent on these chemicals. It's scary as hell to me that it's 90% of the corn grown in the United States uses this specific plant this genetically modified corn created by Monsanto so that Monsanto can also create the herbicide that you need to put on that corn to make it grow. And if anybody tries to challenge that, suddenly we have a plant that's too big to fail. And I think this is a major problem. I'm not sure that it's necessarily on the same scale in a way as things like global warming. It's something that's going to sort of chips away at us, and we need to change the paradigm so that we're not just putting these chemicals out there and waiting for people to die so that there's enough epidemiology that we can prove that this is a chemical that shouldn't be there, and by then it's a $20 billion chemical, so we can't really fight it. I mean, it's a system that's designed to put hazardous chemicals out there.
And they have insecticides.
So with complete cooperation of all governments, what is the fastest possible ramp-up time to switch to very heavily sustainable sources of energy?
All right, let me address that too. I'm going to actually give you a little bad news, which is so solar, which is by far the largest available renewable energy resource, larger than wind and hydropower and biomass and geothermal all combined. The primary way that we use solar energy today from a technological standpoint is with solar panels that are made out of silicon. That's, if you're going to buy solar panels and put them on your rooftop today, they're almost guaranteed to be based on silicon. And there are great things about silicon. First of all, there's a whole bunch of it on the planet. It comes from quartz sand. Think about how much sand there is. We're not going to run out of silicon, right? There's plenty of it out there. And they're also, those panels work really well. They're the most efficient commercial panels you can buy are made out of silicon. So it works really well, and there's lots of it out there. But there's two problems with silicon solar panels. They need extremely pure silicon, like super duper pure, 99.9999% pure, and it's got to be crystalline, which means you need to melt silicon. Think how hot you'd have to make something like sand to melt it, to make it crystalline. So there's a whole bunch of energy that you put into making these panels, all the way from extracting that quartz sand, purifying the silicon, melting it down, making it crystalline, cutting it up into the wafers and turning it into solar panels. All of that takes energy. And then you plug the thing in and it starts giving you energy back, right? And the question is, how long does it take you to get back the energy that you put in? And there's a term for it. It's called the energy payback time. And the energy payback time, first of all, it will depend, of course, where you are. If you're in a sunnier place, you'll get back the energy faster. So Florida's good, Chicago not as much. It'll take longer in a place like where I live. But that energy payback time in a generally sunny place like, say, Southern Europe, for example, for those silicon solar panels is on the range of a few years, 2-3 years. Now, they'll last you 30 or more years, so you're going to get back tons more energy than you put into making the thing, but it's going to take a long time to get it back. Now, let me tell you what the problem with that is that if we want to scale up solar to make a massive dent in our energy mix, right now it's like nothing almost of our energy mix. Even though it's growing, the industry is growing like crazy, 30 to 50% per year, solar industry is growing, which any industry would be thrilled with that type of growth rate, right? But that's not fast enough. If you want to scale up at the speed that's really required to make an impact on climate disruption, I'm not sure if we're going to be able to do it with silicon solar panels, because where are we going to get the energy from to make the things in the first place at the speed that's required to really make a dent? If we didn't care about the time frame, if climate disruption weren't imposing a time frame of decades on us, if we could wait a century, then no problem. Lots of silicon, we can make them, and we'll get tons of energy from that without a problem. But this relatively long energy payback time with silicon is going to challenge us if we really want to scale up solar to be a huge part of the energy mix. That's the bad news. The good news is that there are alternative technologies on the horizon. And that's the kind of stuff we work on at the laboratory where I do research. We work on next generation technologies like organic solar cells. And that's not organic like produce at Whole Foods, like the products back here. That's organic as in carbon-based materials, polymers. And you can do these at very little embedded energy. It takes very little energy to make these things. You can do them super cheap, roll to roll, high speed, cover really large areas really fast. Today, the efficiencies aren't high enough and their stability is not high enough to keep them out there for long enough to make a difference, but that's what we're working on, and lots of people all over the world are working on that. So there are technological solutions coming. They're not there today. Today, we can use silicon solar panels, but if we really ramp it up, there's going to be a roadblock there.
So does that mean that really right now what we need to do more than anything is intensely fund research for solar energy? Is that this thing we should be focusing on?
That's one piece of the puzzle. So, I mean, that limit of how fast you can make them, we're nowhere near that limit. We should be making them at 10 times or 100 times the scale that we are today. Even that might not be enough to really make the dent that we have to make to give you a sense for the scale of the problem here. It's only if we were going to get terawatts of energy from solar energy, trillions of watts. So globally, we use 18 terawatts today. And so if you want solar to be a huge piece of that, 10 terawatts or something like that, you have to make terawatts worth of solar panels. You need to put in terawatts to make those things. We don't have that available today. So if you're going to talk about the terawatt scale, you can't do it with silicon fast enough to really combat climate disruption on the time scale that's imposed on us.
So if the focus is rapidly moving forward with sustainable energy sources like solar and wind and geothermal and things like that, are there things that we should be doing to sequester the carbon? Should we be planting trees? Should everyone be planting 10 trees a year? Are there specific things we should be doing aside from working on better sources of energy for these carbon in the atmosphere? Should we be, I've occasionally hear terms like, I don't even know what it is, like they something with charcoal or something?
Biochar.
Biochar and planting trees, and there's ways to sequester it in the soil. I mean, is there something else we should be doing?
Trying to sequester carbon out of the air is certainly a good goal. The problem is most things do take energy to do it. There are some techniques like phytoplankton fertilization with iron dust in the ocean that some people think is scary. I think it certainly should be studied. It's a natural system that could sequester a lot of carbon dioxide, but we certainly should experiment with getting carbon out of the air, but the problem is we're putting it up in the air so much faster at the moment. So it's kind of this bathtub, model that people use sometimes. We've got two or three problems. The world wants more and more energy, as Seth says. How are we going to produce that without exacerbating the warming is the fundamental problem. Even if we could magically stop putting more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere today, we'd still be left with a carbon blanket, in effect, that traps enough heat that the ice would keep melting and sea level would rise anyway, so we've got to deal with that. We've got to figure out a way to reduce the carbon that's in there, sequestering, like you say. And then we still have this problem of other resources, water and food, and then the disease, so it's certainly a complex problem, and it's not to make it seem futile or insurmountable. Quite the contrary. I think we need to think bigger. And I do get back to governance. We're governing ourselves, as several people have said here, in a terrible manner. We know that, whether it be that legislatures from Australia to the United States have fallen into the hands of large corporations, as you've named, that most citizens don't vote, in our country at least, but that more fundamentally, I think we've distorted the marketplace. I actually believe the marketplace can be a very dynamic place, but we distort it. We subsidize it, as I said, for corn ethanol, just as one example, but milk is subsidized and, all sorts of things, petroleum subsidized. I think we need to, the burden of government is huge because we don't see the real prices, and I think we should see the real price on carbon. As Seth said, I think we need to find ways to show the real costs of things, because most of us will make an intelligent decision if we're faced with that cost, and it's being hidden from us. And I do think that as things get worse in the next couple of decades, which I do think it will, unfortunately, I hope it motivates us almost to a revolutionary attitude toward how we govern ourselves. And I think sometimes you have to wait for the crisis. As I think Rahm Emanuel, we were talking about Chicago the other day, the mayor of Chicago had a saying when he was chief of staff for Barack Obama that, never let a good crisis go to waste was, I can't remember how he said it. But to some degree, I think that the pending crisis, we need to look at that way. I think that we need to be ready to look at how we solve these problems and what our preconceptions are. Again, if letting the planet go 5 or 10 degrees warmer, which is totally inhospitable to life as we know it, is the biggest problem, then that should be a big issue. If nuclear is a paramount issue, as it is to Helen, then maybe that has to supersede that. I wouldn't agree with that, but that's a decision, and that gets back to having a lot of smart people around the table and deciding your priorities. As Bob says, maybe it's water and epidemiological issues of disease vectors. The world's changing very quickly. We're running an experiment. We're really running the world's biggest experiment. What is it like at 8 or 10 billion people where you haven't thought these things through very well without constraints and letting population just burgeon where it will, and Monsanto, the issues with food supply. Hopefully we'll learn from this experiment. The experiment's not going very well right now.
I'd like to say 2 things. I think that this panel is practicing psychic numbing. Because what I said about nuclear war is true, and you know about it. He's been a member of Physicians for Social Responsibility, and we've talked about this for years, but things are at crisis level. We won't have to worry about global warming because we'll have nuclear winter, but I can't tell you how serious this is. And really, we're not addressing it. It is the most serious issue facing the planet now. Because if there's a nuclear war and it'll occur and it'll all be over in about an hour, that's it. And the United States wants to keep its nuclear weapons. That's why I wrote a book called Missile Envy, a la Freud. Because if you watch the missiles go up, they're like missile erectors. And that's a term the military uses, with 2 big balls of fire. And it's the generals hated that book, but they all had a copy on their bookshelves in the Pentagon. Things are terribly serious, and we're not addressing that. Yes, global warming is very serious too. So I really want to... There's a big psychology behind this. The etiology or the cause of what we're discussing is our psychology. That's the cause. And then we need to start examining why we do things, how we do things, who are the sociopaths we put in power who have no moral conscience. So that's the first thing. The trees, I come from Australia where we have quite a lot of forests and gum trees, eucalyptus trees, which just explode with, we call them wildfires, but bushfires. We're chopping them down like there's no tomorrow. And I see these truckloads of dead trees going up to make paper and being shipped as wood chips to Japan to make paper. And it's like truckloads of dead people because it takes a tree hundreds of years to trap the carbon. If you use a tree for building, the carbon still remains in the wood. But if you burn it, you release the carbon. In the tropics, in Malaysia, I go there sometimes, they're chopping down their forests. They're wonderful tropical forests with gorillas and all sorts of wild species to plant palm oil. Palm oil is in everything, chocolate and almost everything we use. And the forests which contain these extraordinary species are being destroyed at a hugely rapid rate. In West Papua New Guinea, which is run by Indonesia, the huge companies come in and they say to the tribal chief, "We'll give you a motorboat if you let us chop down your forest." Well, the tribes live under the trees and get all their food. So yes, they say, okay, we'd like a motorboat. Suddenly their forest is gone, it's all mud, but they don't even have the fuel to power the motorboat. That's happening all the time. At the Amazon, I went there years ago to see it before it's destroyed. They're now making roads through the Amazon, and as they make roads, side roads go off. They're finding gold and oil in the Amazon. That's a huge, huge carbon trap, the Amazon. And it's starting to die from drought as well. It's quite extraordinary experience to go to the Amazon. The forests here, you've chopped them down from the east coast all the way to the west coast to make paper. And I addressed that yesterday. So trees are very important. I don't know. I don't know the studies that if we all planted 10 trees a day, and trees grow quite fast, what difference it would make to global warming, and it would take a long time. Incidentally, carbon dioxide is a fertilizer for trees. They grow faster when the carbon dioxide is higher in the atmosphere, as do all other plants. Just one aspect of the whole issue.
You know, I'm not sure John got it quite right when he said we were conducting an experiment, because it's not really an experiment, because we don't get to have a control planet where we don't make stupid mistakes. And and so what we have going on here, I think the way we care for the environment is the moral issue of our time. Yeah. And I think, you know, if you want to do something as an individual, the way we get people to make decisions that are not in their immediate self-interest is something that we call religion. Yeah. And I think the religions of the world and the religious leaders of the world need to seize this issue, yeah, or they are morally bankrupt. Yep. Because as individuals, we can go to our churches and our synagogues and our mosques and say, you know, this is really important. You need to talk about these issues, and people need to be motivated on these issues, because if we don't act on these issues, the kinds of things that Helen was just talking about are likely to be the kinds of things that precipitate the nuclear war that she's so afraid of.
Well, we all are.
Yeah, that's true. That would, I mean,
that's not me. I'm going to be dead
that
soon.
She's so afraid of, and we should be afraid of. I mean, I think, you know, if we don't find a way to sustainability that is somewhat controlled, a crisis of epic proportions will get us there in ways that we can't imagine and don't really want to have happen.
What about the Pope?
The Pope.
Yes.
I like the Pope.
I like the Pope too.
Yeah. Finally, we have a good Pope.
He's bad on women, but he's good on everything else.
Yeah. I mean, it's a big improvement over the past popes.
Frankie.
Lester Brown from the World Watch Institute writes wonderful books. He wrote World on Edge, Plan B 4.0. I think he's wonderful. But he kind of really, it seems like his focus is really on that we got to make sure we have enough food and water. And he keeps saying that, hey, our food supplies are actually lower than they used to be. And he's like, everyone has a short memory. 25 million people starved in China like some 50, 60, 70 years ago at some point. And he talks about climate change, but he's very concerned about us actually having food shortages and water shortages. And what is the best actions to be taking to make sure that we are appropriately dealing with that? Because what he's also saying is when you have that, then you have failed states, and then that creates more volatility in the world.
But the third rail that underlies all that is population. Nobody wants to talk about it. And most people would say that at a sustainable level, back to sustainability, not only the 10 billion that is the current projection, 9.5 billion by mid-century, but even the current 7 billion people, as they all strive for the American or the Western lifestyle, is not a sustainable number. So when you really want to say, wait, let's stop fooling ourselves and avoiding the question, the 600-pound gorilla in the room, the fact is, as long as you want to let every person on the planet have as many kids as they want, and psychologically or morally we tend to want to let them do that, although population planning is certainly advanced in many areas and with great success, but nobody that I've seen can describe a sustainable planet at 7 billion people. And so as long as we keep skirting around the issues of the quality of water and how to keep the climate lower and or warming and how to produce enough energy and tension about nuclear weapons, and the truth is we have to deal with a more basic problem about that. When we disrupted the natural balance through good medicine, I mean, I mean this positively, that if you think about it, there was a high mortality in man just like there was in other species until we came up with antiseptics and, and the normal things that changed.
Immunization.
Right, that really very, very positive medical things. Well, at some point, if we were smart, we would have said, wait a minute, how do you go from 10% survival at birth to 90% survival and not change your policies about reproduction, if you think about it? That, in other words, we had the ability to change survivability on this planet. We did it. We through great medical change, okay? But somehow we didn't have the emotional ability to say, wait a minute, if we're going to go from high mortality rates, as in most populations at birth, and keep everybody alive we want to keep alive at birth and death, at young age and old age, we're going to tinker with the population capacity of the planet. But nobody wants to talk about it. Or, population planning groups do, and a few groups do. We have to deal with that as part of our mix for the future that we want for our grandkids and great-grandkids. Because the truth is, as you say, whether it be the Catholic Church or other groups that don't want to deal with the population issue, that underlies most of the other problems. We can't pretend we're going to produce enough energy with enough clean water and keep the tensions out of the Middle East about nuclear weapons and all these other things headed for 10 billion people.
That brings in religion.
Okay.
Address it. Go on.
Well, fine, but with all the diverse
All the
religions, and listen,
to reproduce.
And religions spanning from, the Christian, Catholic religions to the Jew, to the Muslim, to all the to Buddhist, Hindu, and so on, religions are not uniform at all, of course. They're all over the place in terms of these attitudes. But the fastest growing religions on the planet right now, the Muslims, I believe encourage lots of children. And,
That's why they're fast-growing religions.
Right, that would make sense. Thank you. That makes sense. That's why you're the smart guy. So as we try and envision and talk about and advocate for a better world, which is what we're here doing, personally in our community, our families, our communities, our nations, and internationally, I think we really do need to responsibly look at this underlying question, that we have to begin to think about the really, really sensitive issue about population planning in a different way, because it underlies all these other issues: energy, food, water,
and then that brings
disease.
us back to women, how the Muslims treat the women, and they have to cover themselves up except for their eyes, and they're to be seen, and they're not to be seen actually, because they're provocative to men who might want to make more babies. But anyway, they still make more babies. I'm reading a very interesting book now called Headscarves and Hymens, about how in Egypt, when women are arrested, the police examine them to see if they still have hymens. And it's a very common thing in Egypt and many Muslim countries. And if you're not a virgin in Saudi Arabia, you can't join the armed forces or anything like that, or in Egypt, because you don't have a hymen. It's quite extraordinary, this. But fundamentally, the women in many, many countries have babies after babies after babies after babies. We know how to stop it. We educate them and provide them. It wouldn't take much money in the scheme of things to provide all women with contraceptives and education about how to stop having babies. Or maybe we do a laser strata, which is a Greek play where the men kept fighting and fighting and killing each other, and finally the women said no sex until you stop fighting. They stopped. And that happened in Liberia too, recently. So there's the whole underlying dynamic of what you just addressed, I think, which we need to be brave enough to look at. And it's terribly serious. Yeah.
There's no way to solve this problem. Yeah. I don't think there's any way to solve this problem.
Of overpopulation?
Without dealing with population at some point.
Yep.
Right.
Maybe we just perform vasectomies on... No, I won't say that. I used to say we need to put contraceptives in the water supply of the world, and everyone can have as lots of sex as they want And then eventually in 100 years we'll all die out, and that would be good for the elephants and the lions and tigers, and the earth wouldn't be any the less poor, the poorer without us. That's a joke. But there's reason why I said that.
There's currently a drought in California, which is an area that grows a lot of the food for the country and possibly other parts of the world. What should we be doing to prevent droughts?
Well, drought is, of course, changing weather patterns, and as somebody pointed out today, climate, I guess it was... Seth, you were talking about difference in climate and weather. I'm sorry, you had a good definition of that. That when we look at climate, and when drought of what's 3 or 4 years now, I guess it's been an extreme drought in California, a record drought. Does that bridge into climate or not? I mean, it's certainly not quite to the climate test yet. But no doubt the weather patterns are changing and almost certainly linked to the changing ocean currents and the typical atmospheric currents like the jet stream. The El Niños, La Niñas, and the Gulf Stream, or the Atlantic Meridional overturning current. Those currents are changing, and it's partly affects everything from temperature regimes and why we get warmer temperatures in the Arctic, which is melting more snow, but colder temperatures in the East Coast of the United States and more snowfall. But the patterns we're used to are changing. And I think it's safe to say that the drought is probably related to that, would be the farthest we can go. Who knows how long it will persist? But what's happening is we've warmed the planet 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit, almost 1 degree Celsius. The temperature regimes in the ocean, which are really complicated, are changing. And we're measuring it, but measuring the miles of depth of ocean with the complexity of currents is really difficult to do. But there is stronger and stronger evidence that the shifting in these ocean currents, which looks like it does relate to warming the whole system, it makes sense, is going to create weird weather, unpredictable weather, patterns that are outside of the norm of patterns. And I think I said it in my talk this morning that you just keep hearing about more and more weird weather, like droughts or extreme rains in places and extreme snowfall in places, because we're used to expecting weather patterns. April showers bring May flowers, and hurricane seasons from June 1st to September 30th. And slowly but surely, all of those patterns are disappearing. And I think unfortunately, we have to get used to that, because as the planet is warming, those patterns of the last few thousand years that we become very used to are disappearing. And so when you ask, what are we going to do about drought? Well, we don't know. The problem is we don't know how long that drought will persist. But assuming it persists for another 2 or 3 years, California is going to have to make some really tough choices. And while most people think it's to stop people from planting lawns or having golf courses, 80% of their water goes to agriculture, which is one of the biggest earners for the state and the biggest producers for food. So this all starts to come together. And like you say, I mean, you can't move enough water easily. It's pumping water. I think pumping water right now in California takes 1/3 of the state's energy. I mean, pumping water takes a lot of energy, as Seth said. And desalinating water, which is the likely next step, has a big side effect. It takes energy, but the brine, what's left over after you've taken the fresh water out of the ocean water is a fairly toxic, not toxic, but dangerously salty substance that's not good for marine life either, and there's a huge amount of salt. So it's not without its own problems. So drought may limit California's growth or force California to give up agriculture, but people, I think, and again, Seth said it, that people are going to live where there's water. Do you want to?
Yeah, you can't. I mean, you can't move water from, like, I live near the Great Lakes. We're not worried about water there. We got plenty. It's the largest freshwater resource on the planet, so I'm okay. But you all have trouble because we can't move that water to you. You just can't do it. You can fill up tankers, super oil tankers all day long, you're not going to get enough water to sustain a city somewhere else. It's kind of funny, actually. The folks around the Great Lakes are actually worried about that. The states and Canadian provinces that border the Great Lakes passed or came to an agreement that they wouldn't allow any water to leave that watershed. So you can't take Great Lakes water outside of the geography where it would drain back into the Great Lakes again, because they were worried about exactly this kind of thing, that we know water scarcity is becoming a massive problem, and they were worried about, and there were some people like Japan, I think, was sending in some tanker ships to take water, but you can't move enough water to sustain another geography, because it's just too much water. The volumes are gigantic, billions of gallons. You just can't move that on a daily basis. It's just not possible. So yeah, you got to live where the water is, and right now the water's not in California. And surely that drought will end at some point. That's not the new normal in California, that it will always be that amount of rainfall. We don't know when, and you can't stop droughts. They're going to get worse, but they were always there. I mean, droughts didn't just originate with climate change. They've always been around. It's just that they're getting worse, more frequent and more severe. And we're going to have to change the way we do agriculture to accommodate that. You end up with these important questions about, so in California, you say agriculture uses almost all the water, absolutely true. But who deserves the water more? The farmer who's growing the food for 100,000 people, or those 100,000 people downstream in the city who would be eating that food? I mean, I don't know how you answer those types of questions. People just have to move.
I mean, the reality is that California has always had a drought. We are trying to grow strawberries in a desert. That water is not California's water. I mean, that came from the north to begin with. And so a big part of the problem is we have tried to engineer reality in a way that you have incredible agriculture across the southwestern United States because you have all this sunshine and we've figured out how to pipe in all this water, but it's not fundamentally a truly sustainable model to begin with. And we have to really revisit the way the entire southwestern United States has developed and recalibrate it to a point where it's adjusted somewhere closer to its natural water supply.
When you're thinking of the Southwest, of course, the cities like Tucson and Phoenix and these cities out in the desert, I mean, it's just bizarre when you fly over them. I'm sure you all have when you fly out west and you see these, millions and millions and millions of houses in places that are
and
naturally...
golf courses.
And golf courses, thank you. In places where there's naturally no water. I mean, it's just crazy. We are going to have to begin adapting to where the water is. The challenge is that even in modern times, in the last 100 or 200 years, we've had a stable climate. Now, climate, again, does change naturally, like the ice ages. That was a natural cycle every 100,000 years. What's really hard in our brains to get straight is that we were in this moment of stability for 5,000 years, where we're going from the warming phase to the cooling phase. And unfortunately, now we're going to the extra warming phase as the oceans rise and the glaciers melt and the temperatures rise. It's really hard for us to see that. But the fact is
we think in terms of human lifetime.
Right.
That's our real
and
problem.
on that note, I
Four-year
want to talk
political
about
cycles
food. Since the North American Free Trade Agreement and NAFTA and all this utter rubbish that the corporations are orchestrating behind our backs, our farmers in Australia had to plough their orange orchards under because we were getting orange juice from Brazil. And if you go into your supermarkets and look where your food comes from, it has a huge carbon footprint. They're importing stuff from all over the world. This is wicked, absolutely wicked. And there was talk today, I think, about communities living in small areas and having their own villages and coffee shops where people can mingle instead of driving lots of miles to go and get a pint of milk. And also growing community gardens and only eating what you can eat. And think of the pioneers, or what did you call them, the pilgrims, when they came here. They used to grow beans and everything and salt it during the winter. So they had food for the winter and tubers and potatoes and the like. Why shouldn't we go back to that again instead of thinking we can have strawberry shortcakes in the middle of winter? Huh? Or pavlovas, or do you know what a pavlova is? It's named after Anna Pavlova when she came to Australia, the Russian dancer. And it's a big meringue piled with cream and covered with berries and strawberries and raspberries. It's absolutely delicious and really bad for your heart.
Later this week, we're going to have a bunch of people. We're going to have Hope Ahonek, we're going to have Will Tuttle, we're going to have David Simon, we were going to have Richard Oppenlander, but we have all their books. And basically what they're saying is eating animals is the worst of everything. It uses the most carbon, uses the most water, uses the most land, cuts down the most trees. All the poop from the animals creates dead zones, and there's a list that goes on. And so what they're saying is, listen, there's a lot of things you could do, but the number one thing that a single individual person could do immediately is stop eating animal products completely for all these reasons. Now, you addressed that alone is not going to be the solution enough, but does this seem like on your list, according to Richard Oppenlander's book, he's saying that 51% of all greenhouse gases comes from the raising of animals. I won't try to explain how he got to that number, but does this seem to you like this belongs on the list very high up as another very important step to take, even if you yourselves don't eat this way?
Absolutely. Yeah,
it's a great question, but I like all the statistics, and somebody did show me that statistic today. You have to be very careful what it's saying. 51% of. I don't think that may be of agriculture or domestic uses, but it doesn't count power plants or vehicles or making cement or. Okay, but so how you define that, and would it be a good goal to do internationally? Sure. But the other way to look at that is if I decide to do that, but the planet's still heading where it is, even if I get 1 million people to go with me, have you made a dent in the problem, which I think was implied in your later comment. So we get into this thing of personal commitment, community commitment, if you will, which is important. Like in Miami, the way to look at this is, in Miami, they're concerned about rising sea level, what's happening, they're putting pumps in. And then they're talking about reducing greenhouse gas. And what I've had to explain to people there is that reducing greenhouse gas is a global effect, but has no impact on rising sea level in Miami, because that's determined in Antarctica, if you will. And so there's a difference in personal commitment, which is really important, an example to wider communities, but then being realistic about this impact, globally. So with beef consumption, would it be good to promote it? Or getting off beef? Sure. But is it going to solve the problem? No, as you alluded to. So that's where I think that a balance, making sure we see something as a personal action versus a global solution.
But you have to start somewhere. Ultimately, it is an individual decision. It's sort of a no-brainer in that it's better for your health, it's better for the planet, and so, yeah.
Why not?
You want to be smart how you do it. There's you're absolutely right. There's an enormous amount of embedded water and carbon emissions in that meat. There's no question about that. But as Helen was alluding to, if the strawberries came from halfway around the world, there's a bunch of embedded water and carbon in that too. You want to be eating
Major.
local also.
Major. Yeah. Always look at where your stuff comes from in the supermarket.
You can grow beans almost any place.
Yeah.
Helen, if we leave this panel tonight and we say to our friends, you know what, this situation with the potential of nuclear war is so serious, the United States has to completely get out of this mindset and get rid of it. The first thing someone's going to say is, well, if we get rid of it and the other countries have it, then we're going to be in more danger. So what's your response to that?
You are the model for the rest of the world. Everyone emulates you. You led the nuclear arms race at every step of the way except one, and Russia blindly copied and followed. And because you've got nuclear weapons and developed them first, and they're seen as a symbol of power and authority and masculinity, if you will, not security, they're not for security, other countries think the same way. You have to be the model for the rest of the world. If you start to disarm, and that's what the Pope's going to start talking about, that's what Jesus would do, then Russia, who really wants to get rid of her nuclear weapons because they're getting rusty and very seriously dangerous, she said she'll emulate you. And then you have the moral authority. You have no moral authority to tell anyone that they shouldn't have nuclear weapons, including Iran. You have no moral authority at all. But if you do the right thing, then you could go to the United Nations and say, we've decided we're going to abolish nuclear weapons in America, and we've signed an agreement with Russia that they'll abolish theirs. Only, as I've said, Russia and America can destroy life on the planet. Only Russia and America. But then India and Pakistan could be forced to follow. Do you see what I mean? You can become the leaders. In fact, your lifestyle is leading the world now. And so you have to understand your huge moral authority and huge responsibility as Americans towards life on the planet. And only if you change, will the world change.
So, again, there's people of all ages who watch this on video. There's people here. Some people have thought about these things, some have not. If you were going to give a final statement and they were going to listen to you, and they wanted to take action, they were motivated, they were passionate. Helen, you've made it very clear. You're saying we should understand the dangers of nuclear power and do everything in our power to tell our elected officials to get the heck out of to get out of this situation we're in with the Ukraine and Russia, to get away from nuclear war, and that this is an urgent, imminent crisis that we're psychically numbing ourselves and not dealing with. So that's one thing that we get. That's great.
Yes, and you must become educated. The New York Times is writing absolute rubbish about the Ukraine and blaming Putin, like they wrote rubbish about Iraq and published 5 front-page articles by Judith Miller saying that Hussein had weapons of mass destruction and nuclear weapons, which he didn't. She was already sleeping with Scooter Libby at the time. The New York Times instigated and helped to start that dreadful war in Iraq where 1 million people were killed. So it's doing the same thing again. If you want to really read the truth, go to Consortium News and read a journalist called Robert Parry. He spent the last year in the Reagan Library looking at all the papers and finding out some very interesting stuff. But apart from that, he's done really, really good research on what is happening in the Ukraine, the history of the Ukraine, the Nazis who are still there, who are violently anti-Semitic, working with Poroshenko, the now American puppet, and how dangerous it is. And also watch my symposium, The Dynamics of Possible Nuclear Extinction, which you can find on my webpage at helencaldicott.foundation.org. Educate yourselves, find out, and only then can you become a leader. And each person in this room can be as powerful as the most powerful person who's ever lived. If you get it in your heart and soul, and the passion that will drive you to save the planet and become a true leader, a Joan or John of Arc.
So if each of you would, I guess, give us your final instructions. There's people here. If someone was going to listen to you, if they said, okay, I'm going to listen. So number one, so if I heard what Helen said and someone understands that. So what else would be to take your personal lectures you gave and the panel tonight and the panel last night, if you wanted to try, as much as it's not easy to articulate, but if you wanted to try to articulate what you want, what we individually should do, the most specific step you could think of, I would, one thing you could say is don't eat meat. One other thing you could say is, don't tell only elect officials that are against this situation in Ukraine. What would be the most specific instructions that you want to leave us with and you want everyone to hear if they were going to listen to you?
You asked in what you sent us for, I think, a list of 10 things, so I came up with my 10 things. Drive less, walk more, eat organic, eat less meat or no meat, slow down, question technology, reimagine the future and insist that politicians do the same, study science because the distortion of science is something that's very dangerous, the old adage of reduce, reuse, recycle, and raise wise children and grandchildren because you are borrowing their planet.
Yeah. I've done mine.
Oh, Helen's done. You guys cheated again. That wasn't one.
He said...
He asked once before for a top 10 list. So.
I follow the rules. I'm going to give you one. Seize the opportunity. That's the one. So I think John has said this very poetically, both today and yesterday, that it's very easy to be scared and intimidated by the problem that we face and to become very pessimistic. And there are days, frankly, when I wake up and I'm very pessimistic about this. But it's also our greatest opportunity as a species, that we have the biggest challenge we've ever faced, and that means we have the biggest opportunity we've ever faced. This is our chance to come together and overcome a lot of the petty and stupid mistakes we've made up till now, and to start a new future.
Well, obviously echoing on that, we're going to go through some dark times, and I think we can learn and do better coming out of this, but it's going to be refashioning everything about our society. But it comes down to the simplest single metric, as Seth alluded to, and we only met yesterday, but we seem to share a lot of opinions here, that we do know that at about 900 parts per million, call it 1,000 parts per million of carbon dioxide, this planet, life is not going to, we will not be part of life here, that we will go through a mass extinction, as has happened 6 times in the last 500 million years. And we're well on the way. Even the latest IPCC looks at a projection of up to 900 parts per million this century. So if there's a single thing that needs to drive us, it's got to be to reduce greenhouse gases. If this planet gets 4 or 5 degrees Celsius, 8 or 9 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than it in the last, 100,000 years that we've flourished, we will not be here. So while there are lots of problems, and certainly cows add to greenhouse gas and so on, so all of that ties in, but it's nice to have a single goal. And to me, it's got to be that we have to reduce greenhouse gases, because if not, this planet will literally cook. And everything else, from arts to science to agriculture to world wars and so on, are going to be part and parcel of that. So it sounds singular and perhaps myopic, but if there's one metric, if we just let this greenhouse gas climbing straight up as it is, you saw my graph today, it's vacillated between 180 and 280 over the last 10 million years. It's at 400 and climbing straight up. That needs to be our metric for success. And it can start personally with not eating meat, but it's got to start putting a price on carbon, telling our politicians to do that. And to me, it's an overriding focus. I use sea level rise in the shoreline to get people's attention, but it really comes all around back to, we cannot let us be cooked by greenhouse gases that are going to warm this planet that much.
Let me close by saying that these people have come from around the world. Helen came from Australia. Everyone flew in. These are experts who have studied, put their time in, written these books. If you are fortunate enough to hear this information, whether live, online, or in the future by video, I hope you will understand that it's probably not an accident that you ran into this information. Again, maybe you are supposed to be much more of a leader than you ever thought you are. Maybe you said, I'm not supposed to be a leader because I wasn't really that great in school, I wasn't really that educated, I don't have a degree. That's what everyone told us. Maybe you are supposed to be the nose cone of the rocket and the leader of your community and the one to educate your friends. And if no one in your community seems that interested, maybe that's because you are supposed to be the leader. You're supposed to take this information. You're supposed to get it to everyone you know, get them to see the videos, and maybe you're supposed to play a much, much bigger role than you ever imagined. And I hope you'll consider doing that.